And so it's interesting to look at this, and why this is important is because there's, especially with COVID this year, people are starting to have some curiosity around their food. And so what's driving food security is a big thing, for instance, or food sovereignty, having control over it and getting outdoors. And so there's a curiosity that's kind of coming and reemerging with hunting, but it's with people who haven't traditionally been in that space. It's not my dad and my uncle. It's women who want to get involved with hunting and take control over their food. It's people in urban areas who want to get out and just be able to have some agency in how they're procuring their food. And so it's a very big food aspect part of that. And so I might be getting ahead of myself a little bit, but we're going through this shift. And so it's really important to kind of look forward and think in terms of, how this is going to look and how we put the welcome mat out for hunters and how we engage with the public as well. Hunting, like I said, if there's 11 million hunters in the United States right now, that's like 5% of America. And so it's a very small snapshot of what America is all about. So far, you got about 5% of people that hunt. You got about 90% of the people that don't hunt. And you got about 5% of the people that don't like hunting and just don't feel comfortable, and they're very vocal about it. And so for the most part, the American public is like, okay, yeah, we can live with it. We don't really understand it, but we're going to talk some more here, you and I, about some of these perceptions and how to just approach them.
Absolutely. You said so much quality information in that answer. And I remember back when I took the my hunter safety course, they really preach hard about, going with what you're talking about with like the perception of, the American hunter, let's say. They really preach hard in that class about how you represent all hunters to the non-hunter. And, they're very, very much about making sure that you act in a professional manner, the same way you'd act in a professional manner, like, at a business place, a place of business, because there are so many people that just are very vocal about not being about this life, and wanting to make sure that the new hunters that are coming through hunter safety courses are representing the sport, the activity, the lifestyle, whatever you want to call it, with grace and with class. And I think that's a very good way for them to, the whole point of those courses is to create ethical hunters, and they do a fantastic job in doing that and in informing people who are new to hunting and getting their license for the very first time, taking those courses. And it's almost like with COVID, as you mentioned, how numbers have gone down, but now numbers have gone up since COVID. People want to be able to say, well, crap, I want to be able to be self-reliant and self-sufficient. If something were to happen, I would like to know that I will be able to provide and put food on my table. And I do think that that's a huge reason for this, the spark and the interest of hunting nationwide in slowly starting to come back up. I know since COVID, firearm sales are super high this year, and a lot of those people have also transitioned to hunting as well. I don't remember the number that I saw, but it was a huge number of new hunters out in the woods this year. Our first time hunters in the woods. I didn't catch what the number was. I remember seeing it in passing, many months ago, back when like deer season started. But yeah, I think that is a huge reason that people want to get out there. They want to know about their food, and obviously we don't need, you don't need to live under a rock to know the whole conversation around quality of your food, and this is in your food, and Monsanto that, and steroids this in the animals. It's like it is the way to just be about yourself and to be able to take care of yourself. And I do think that's a huge element to new hunters out in the woods.
Yeah, it certainly is. And I hear that message so much. And I don't know how many new hunters there are either this year, but I think the numbers for the hunter ed classes, which are now online in New York,
Yep.
I think they increased by like 30% or something in that scope. I mean, it was significant. And what you said about, having the curiosity around self-reliance, I think is so important, because I hear that message again and again. And also around the food, and along with the health benefits of thinking through what we're putting in our bodies, what we're nourishing ourselves with sustenance. And what I'm also hearing too is this ethic of I care about how those animals live their life, that there's this like connection, informing us a connection to a landscape. I hear people say, what, I care that animal that is giving its life for me to eat, to keep me alive. I want it to have a good life, a free range life out there somewhere on the mountain. That seems to be like an ethical thing that's better than, being cooped up in a barn someplace on a feedlot in Kansas, for instance. And so, there's this kind of awakening with that too. And so it's like all the benefits of how do I take care of myself, and how do I interact with nature in a responsible way, And so I think that those angles are really thoughtful, and that's where people are coming in, and in the past, where I'll say recruitment has typically, for people like me, it was just, being a kid and doing it with my folks and getting up to the point where I'm old enough to get a license. And so now that's not really the case. I mean, kids are still doing it who are growing up in hunting families, but it's a diverse community of people, and mostly adults and a lot of women. And so it's, as a hunter, I look at that scenario and I say, okay, how can we be inviting? Because how can we put the welcome mat out for people who are trying this, who want to see themselves in this space, but don't know if they're really welcome? I think that that's really important to kind of think through, along with the kind of the professional, how we approach it and how people see our optics in terms of, what we're representing as hunters, but also just like how we're representing community, how inviting we are for people to come in. And there's benefits to that, right? So, more people at the table, more people coming into the community just makes for better voices, better decisions for wildlife and the habitat that we love, and also ultimately more funding as well. So there's a lot of things to unpack around that. But that's what I kind of get excited about and think about. And that's a lot of the kind of the pillars of the podcasting that I've been doing over on my channel.
Sure, absolutely. And, hunting has been a way of life for centuries, thousands of years. So, it's not anything new. And those of people who want to embark on the journey, everyone is welcome. It's in my opinion, it's in you because of us being human beings. I feel like that's just kind of it's inside of all of us. So I'd like to move on to and address some of these, kind of like misconceptions that the public tends to have about hunters. And when I say the public, I mean maybe not so either, the people who are very strict and anti-hunting will have some misconceptions, as well as people who might just not know. And again, it's kind of what you talked about, how they saw this little clip here, this little clip there, or they know, their old neighbor was a hunter, and they therefore, like I mentioned in the hunter safety course, how every hunter represents all hunters to the non-hunter. Maybe that person wasn't exactly the shining star of the hunting communities, but in their brain, that's who they're thinking. So I just wrote down a bunch of misconceptions that I've heard, arguments I've heard from people, or just like general conversations in passing that I feel like I'll touch on a lot of the subjects right now. So I'm just going to read kind of like a misconception, and then you take us through kind of what does your brain say when you hear this. So let's start with number one right here. So hunting harms the environment. Killing animals hampers with the ecosystem. And it's a harm to the environment. What's your take on that misconception?
Yeah, so I'm going to say that to start there, I'm going to say that what we really have to think about is what's hunting's role in a modern world, right? This is how we're going to approach these conversations about misperceptions. Is there a role? And so what we're finding is yes, there is a role. And in terms of harming the environment, so there is a morally challenging kind of thing to get around with hunting because what if somebody doesn't hunt? They're going to sit there and say, how can you say that you love these animals that you're protecting, but you're also shooting them to eat them, right? And
Hmm.
so I get the irony and the conflict and the tension around all that. How do you get your head around that? Is it even ethical? And the question really isn't like what I found is it's not so much is hunting ethical. It's under what conditions is it ethical? And where does it make sense to be ethical? When is it ethical? When it's not? But in terms of the environmental impacts of hunting, I will say that everybody has a footprint, and so if you go out and participate in nature and choose to hunt, and you shoot an animal that you're going to take home and eat, that does have a ripple effect through the ecology of that landscape, right? Because you are impacting it, you're putting your footprint down, and you're changing that landscape a little bit. But like I said before, if you look at how hunting has contributed to habitat over the last 100 years, the funding that has come through these regulated science-based programs for hunting in an ethical way have created way more habitat and way more environmental benefit than they have harm. Okay. So when we're talking about hunting, we're not talking about unregulated market mass extinction kind of stuff. We're talking about hunting animals that have sustainable populations, that is kind of like science based through wildlife principles. And so, yes, we all have a footprint. Yes, hunters contribute positively to the environment. So that's what I'm going to say.
Yeah, it's totally a common misconception that people don't realize that
Hmm.
um, the fees that we pay for our licenses and tags go directly back into the wildlife conservation of the region. So that it brings in a lot of money that goes directly back right into the environment, which is a terrific thing. All right, here we
Yep.
go. Misconception number 2: hunters are cruel to the animal kingdom in general.
Yep. I can understand if somebody never hunted and they have a perception of Bambi
Hmm.
and they think, how can you go out and shoot Bambi? I mean, that's probably the one thing I've heard more than anything. And I get that. I get the fact that as humans, we have emotions and we relate emotionally to nature and wildlife. We tend to humanize some of this stuff. We name them, so it's very hard to think that somebody would go shoot an animal to eat. But with that being said, let's talk about cruelty a little bit. And the fact is, look, for folks, if you do eat meat, if you choose to eat meat, then there's a consequence to that. So whether you hunt or not, those the meat that you eat came from an animal, and so how in a lot of cases, mass farming, factory farming kind of things like chicken and pigs and different things like that, they have a much harder life from an ethical standpoint than wildlife might have out in the woods. And so, I get the fact that it feels like you would be saying it's cruel to go out and kill an animal, to eat it. But I think the thing is that when you approach it in the spirit of saying, look, I am trying to have control over the food that I eat and how it lives, then I could make the case that it's actually a less cruel approach to eating meat. And if you don't eat meat, that's your ethic and that's great. And I think that vegans and hunters actually have quite a bit in common. Mostly it's a mindfulness. They come to different conclusions, but I appreciate and respect people that have that mindfulness around their food and can make decisions and change their behavior about it.
Sure. I think also too, something that people don't tend to think about or kind of realize, like out in nature, there's only a few ways that animals die. They die from, starvation,